let's get started. Yeah, I don't agree with I think it's utilitarianism, honestly. But that's me. All right, here we go. So I just talked about, thank you anyways. And thank you, Joe. So we're going to go to the after effects. After this, many Union men left the state permanently, and the new rule of organized anarchy ensued. The New Orleans riot was a characteristic gesture of the time and place. Most of the elected white members of the convention kept in the background to see what trouble was brewing. Black people assembled, most of them as spectators, to find out what was going on. What was going to be done for their enfranchisement. It was these black spectators upon whom the brunt of the murder and assassination fell. There was an unusual moral aftermath to the inexcusable slaughter, thank you, in that it helped turn the national election of 1866 overwhelmingly against Andrew Johnson. It was against this black background of lawlessness and murder, this practical reopening of the Civil War and congressional Reconstruction began. Under the National Reconstruction Act in Louisiana, 127,639 registered, of whom 82,907 were black people. When black suffrage seemed inevitable, some efforts was made on the part of the planters to gain the black support. They began by, cajoling the field hands. In a meeting in Rapid Parish held by the planters, they said they would, quote, hold in high esteems the freemen among us who ranged themselves on our side, end quote. Duncan F. Kenner, and a prominent politician, urged the people to accept black people and to try to gain their vote for the South. General P.G.T. Beauregard, who began to fight at Fort Sumter and wanted to raise the black flag of emancipation, said, quote, if the suffrage of black people is properly handled and directed, we shall defeat our adversaries with our own weapons. Black people is Southern born. They use the N word with the O at the end, just to let you know. While with a little education and a property qualification, he can be made to take in an interest in the affairs of the South and in its prosperity. He will fight with the whites. On March 18th, General Longstreet, a Confederate general, published 2 open letters advising submission to Congress. Quote, it becomes us to insist that suffrage be extended in all the states and fully tested. Other prominent Confederates agreed. Longstreet's wife afterwards declared that this was the noblest act of her husband's life. But these overtures of a few planters were more than neutralized by the bulk of white Southern opinion, which was better beyond description. All Republicans were bitterly assailed. Quote, the shameless, heartless, vile, grasping, deceitful, creeping, crawling, wallowing, slimy, slippery, hideous, lonesome political pirates who, in the name of God and liberty, robbed the South and put the Southern states under a black government. Ooh, end quote. Another quote, everything was said that would disparage or discredit the officials. Nothing was said to explain or justify their acts or their conduct, end quote. On the 25th of April, 7 days after the election, the officers under new Constitution, the Courier, and the Tetchy said, 14 men having a covering of white skin over their flesh have voted for the, I can't say that word, Constitution. I don't know what else to say besides that. In the parish of St. Martin, but may they be pointed out with the finger of scorn by all honorable men. May they be despised and hated. by every living creature. May their wives, and if such creatures can have wives, remain barren, that their descendants may not rot in jail or die of exhaustion in the house of ill fame. What an asshole. The banner. He used the M word, so that was bad. The banner, the leading papers in its congressional district, said on the 20th of June, as the Republican members of the legislature and state government were assembling in New Orleans. These miserable devils are worse than the itch, smallpox, measles, overflows, droughts, and pestilence. On the other hand, black people kept hammering at their economic condition. A meeting was held in the First African Church in May 1867 to colonize black labor or people of color laborers on homesteads by people of color. From this time until the new Constitutional Convention met, the Tribune pled for a high class of delegates to the convention. And here's what they say. From the president down to the doorkeeper, and from the clerk and the chief reporter down to the printer, the choice should be made so as to convince the people of the state that the supremacy of privileged class were no longer fostered, and at the time has come when the representatives of the people of color race have find favor, as well as white men. It is to be demonstrated that long services and unfaltering devotion to the cause of radicalism shall obtain the reward, irrespective of color or race. And to the effect, it is important to choose officers from among both populations. But there is something more. It is important to show that the oppressed race will not be overlooked. That from this time forward, the rights of the neglected race will be recognized to share in all departments of our state government. The convention will have many things to do to break the spell under which we are laboring. The choice of officers will, therefore, have a political bearing and cannot be dedicated by fitness only. The convention will meet under very peculiar circumstances of originality and grandeur. It will be the first constitutional assembly, the first official body ever convened in the United States without distinction of race or color. It will be the first mixed assemblage, clothed with a public character. As such, this convention has to take a position in immediate contradiction with the old assemblies of white men's government. They will have to show that a new order will succeed the former order of things, and that the long neglected race will, at least effectually, share in the government of the state. Hold on a second. Won't get much. By agreement, the 98 delegates of the Louisiana Convention consisted of 49 black people, 49 whites. Among black people were many free men of color and of intelligence, property, and character. But when it was suggested that subordinate officers be equally divided between the race, PBS Pinchback, one of the leaders of color, objected and declared that was placing race above merit. The black members of the Constitutional Convention took a prominent and effective part. They were largely represented on the committees, such as the Committee of 13 on Rules and Regulations, where they had 4 members. In several cases, they acted as chairman of the committee, as in the case of the Committee on the Militia and the Committee on the Bill of Rights. Their attitude, however, is best seen in the report of the committee to draft a constitution. The 5 white members of the committee and the 4 members of color differed in certain essential particulars, and sent in respectively a majority and minority report. The chief points of difference were these. The white men wished to deprive all the leaders of the Confederacy of the right to vote or hold office, while the men of color would allow them to vote, but restricted their rights to hold office. The white men wished to prevent any laws being passed regulating labor or fixing wages. The men of color wish no such restriction, and also demand that children bond out under the former black laws should be returned to their parents and relatives. The white men made provisions for the education of youth, but the men of color were more specific and demanded at least one free public school in every parish to be provided for by public taxation, and with no distinctions as to race and sex. They also asked for the university with 6 faculties and the state lottery for the support of education and charity, while the white men wanted 98 states representatives. The men of color wanted 102, which probably gave certain people of color sections a larger representation. In the final constitution, a compromise provided that no law should be passed fix the price of manual labor, that there should be 101 representatives, that the Confederate leaders should neither vote nor hold office, and that the men of color proposal for education included no separation in schools, and a university should prevail. The men of color assented to this constitution, but 2 of them, Pinchback and Bladen, together with 2 white men, protested against the disenfranchisement of former Confederates. Quote, "As we are now and ever have been advocates for universal suffrage." End quote. It is interesting to note that the men of color who published the Daily Tribune were the official printers of the convention journal. The convention adopted the Constitution March 19th, 1868. This Constitution made black people equal to whites and provided equal rights and privileges. Public schools were thrown open to both races. All adult male citizens resident in Louisiana for 1 year could vote, except certain classes of Confederates. The labor law passed by the Democratic legislature in 1865 were declared null and void. The planters revealed the Constitution and called it, quote, "the work of the lowest and most corrupt body of men ever assembled in the South. It was the work of arrogant, ignorant black people cooperating with a gang of white adventurers, strangers to our interests and our sentiments. It was originated by carpetbaggers, and was carried through by such arguments as are printed on greenback paper. It was one of the long catalogs of schemes of corruption which make up the whole history of the I don't know this word.
Iniquitous, but look it up.
Iniquitous radical conclave. Thank you. In the face of this, the law of Louisiana was codified. On the basis of this constitution and subsequent legislation were finally adopted in 3 main codes, signed by Black Lieutenant Governor of the state, Oscar J. Dunn, and remain to this day as the basic law of the state. The free black people had since the war increased in numbers, wealth, and intelligence. On the other hand, the mass of freemen were ignorant and inexperienced, and much lower in status because of their harsh slavery than even the black people of South Carolina. They had, however, 2 ever insistent demands: land to cultivate and public schools. They had almost impoverished themselves under banks to keep their schools going. And while their demands for land never reached the definite expression of that it did elsewhere, it was always the great motivating ideal. The people of color produced some notable leaders during the Reconstruction. Oscar J. Dunn ran away from slavery and finally bought his freedom. He had laid the foundation for a good education before he became free. Dunn, quote, was the only one of the 7 men of color who sat in the state senate in 1868 who had been a slave, end quote. He was lieutenant governor in 1868 and 1870. And was a man of courage and firmness. He was admitted by the Democrats to be incorruptible. Quote, in the view of the Caucasian chief, the taint of honesty and of the scrupulous regard for the official proprieties is a serious drawback.
Proprieties.
Yes, there's a serious drawback and enervating approach upon the lieutenant governor. His sudden death in November 1871 was a severe loss. Pinchback, son of a white man, and himself indistinguishable from white, a personal appearance, was born in Georgia, educated in Cincinnati, and had been a captain in the army. He was intelligent and capable, but a leader of different caliber than from Dunn. He was a practical politician and played the politician game. Yet there were limits beyond which he could not go. To all intents and purposes, he was educated, well-to-do, congenial white man, but with a few drops of black blood, which he did not stoop to deny as so many of his fellow whites did. Pinchback succeeded Dunn as lieutenant governor, and when Warmoth was impeached in December 1872, Pinchback became for a few days governor of the state. C.C. Antonio later was also lieutenant governor. The legislature sent J.M. Menard, a man of color, as one of the representatives of the lower house of Congress, but he was refused his seat. Antonio Debucklet was state treasurer during 1868 to 1879. He conducted his office for 18 years without mistake or criticism. Politicians tried to find something wrong with his record, and the Aldiger Committee was appointed to examine the archives of the Treasury. They secured 3 expert accountants to investigate the Treasury for 6 months. The honesty and efficiency of the treasurer was confirmed. There were the following people of color officials in Louisiana, and here they are. They have them listed, everybody. Here we go. Charles E. Nash, Congress, 1874 to 76, 44th Congress. P.B.S. Pinchback, Governor, 1872, 43 days, Lieutenant Governor, 1871 to 72. Oscar J. Dunn, Lieutenant Governor, 1868 to 71. C.C. Antonio, Lieutenant Governor, 1872 to 76. P.G. Deslodi, Secretary of State, 1872 through 76. Antonio D. Bucklet, State Treasurer, 1868 to 69. W.G. Brown, Superintendent of Public Education, 1872 to 76. Augustine G. Jones, once chicanery clerk of Assumption's Parish, was a direct descendant of the hero John Paul Jones of a Revolutionary War fame, who was captain of the Bonhomme Richard. Several of his daughters are now teachers in the New Orleans public schools. In addition, there were between 1868 and 1896, 32 people of color state senators and 95 representatives. These people of color leaders had a task of enormous difficulties, much more so than those of South Carolina or Mississippi. They differed in origin and education. Some looked white and some black. Some born free and rich, the recipients of good education. Some were ex-slaves with no formal training. They were faced with an intricate social tangle among the whites. Economic and social differences were in Louisiana more complicated than in any other American state, and this makes the history of Reconstruction more difficult to follow. First of all, There were the planters, rich before the war, largely officers and leaders of the Confederate Army, and now returning embittered and widely impoverished. Then there were the host of traders, capitalists, and adventurers who had come down during the and just after the war to seek a new field of investment in the conquering country, who were naturally regarded more or less as harpies. The number of formidable for already being the fall of 1866, Fecklin says between 5 to 10,000 Union soldiers had settled in the state. Among these were Warmoth and Kellogg. And to these, the scallywags, the large number of whites, both planters and others, who became Union men during and after the war. Another factor was the enormous poor whites in the northern part of the state, living close to the subsistent line in the thin soil of the Pine Hills back of the bottom lands, without schools, with but few churches, given to rude sports and crude methods of farming. Their arrogance, ignorance, and prejudice bred in them after the emancipation of black people a dread of sinking of to the social level of black people. The dread in turn breed hatred, and it was from this class, instigated very probably by the class above them, that the Colfax and the Conchati murders took their unfortunate rise. And still, on another element, mischievous in the extreme, must be added to the social complex. Men who pursued no occupation but preyed on black and white alike as gamblers and 10th-rate politicians, drinking and swaggering at the bars, while always armed with knife and revolver, shooting black people now and then for excitement. These class recruited largely from the descendants of the old overseer of black trader and antebellum days, had just enough education to enable them to dazzle the black person by the political harangue. They became demagogic leaders of black people on the one hand, and murderers and fighters for the planters. And it was this element that more than anything else kept up the turmoil in the state. According to Nordhoff, quote, the first duty of the Republican leaders in Louisiana was, quote, to hang them by the dozen, end quote. This is still within the quote. And it was because they were not crushed out, except so far as the respectable conservative could combat them, that Louisiana had to endure such a drawn-out purgatory before she was reconstructed, end quote. The number of black people in the legislature of Louisiana is not exactly known, chiefly on the account of the great mixture of blood. I hate when he does that. In the first legislature, there were said to be 42 black people, about half of the House, and 7 black senators. The election showed the predominant influence of the carpetbaggers over the black people. It's so hard because they use the N-word for OE. So like I have to like figure out like ways to like creative ways to make it make sense. Who had good reasons to be convinced of the bad faith of the planters. There was never a majority of black people in either house of the legislature during my 4 years of service as governor. The legislature elected in 1868, at the same time I was elected governor, but had but 6 men of color in the Senate out of its 63 members. And though the House of Representatives had more men of color in it than did the Senate, they never constituted more than 1/3 of the membership. So they really didn't hold any power at all. Political power, really. So it was in the general election of 1870, only 6 out of the 36 members of the Senate were men of color. and there were fewer black people in the House of Representatives than in the House elected in 1868. Whatever legislation may have been worthy of criticism during this administration was the work of white men, in which black members played but a modest part. The real fight that developed in Louisiana was between the planters and, on the one hand, and the newcomers, Northern and Southern, on the other. And these two factions fought to dominate both the poor whites and black people, usually by characteristically different methods. The planters resorted to the old method of congealing the poor whites, giving them some political and social recognitions, and using them as thugs and murderers to carry out their ends, giving the white people the power to do the bidding states through racial violence. The carpetbaggers flattered black people, bribed those who they could, and gave some recognition, but always at some crucial point broke their promises because they knew that black people had no choice, especially in Louisiana. The question of social equality between whites and biracial people was an insistent source of bitter feelings. Two factors soon developed among the Republicans. Warmoth tried to appease the planters and avoid too great dependence of black people. But the Tribune, leading the pure radicals, said in 1868, here's what they said: the Republican Party in Louisiana is headed by men who, for the most part, are devoid of honesty and decency. And we think it right that the country should know it. The active portion of the party in Louisiana is composed largely of white adventurers who strive to be elected to office by black voters. Some of these intend, if elected, to give share of office to men of color. We admit that, but they chose only docile tools, not citizens who have manhood. When the Republicans came to select their candidates for governor, the pure radicals proposed a wealthy man of color, Major F.E. Dumas. Dumas received 43 votes and Warmoth 45. Dumas refused the position of lieutenant governor, and Dunn was nominated. 5 white men and 2 men of color constituted the ticket, and the other men of color being Antonio de Buclet for treasurer. This ticket was elected. The new legislature met June 29th, 1868, and a temporary speaker was a black person, R.H. Isbell. He and Dunn tried to enforce and test oath, as they were legally bound to do, to the greater anger of the rebels, who asked if they were to be excluded, quote, by a black, the N-word. They used the N-word, the R-E-R, from the seats of which they were elected. The legislators spent some time discussing the Civil Rights Bill. This bill went over until the next session and caused high feelings and long discussions. The conservative protest against people of color forcing themselves in where they were not wanted. Pinchback insisted only on equal accommodations. I consider myself just as far above coming into company that does not want me. They as they are above my coming into the evaluation of them, with them. I do not believe that any sensible man of color upon this floor would wish to be in a private part of a public place without the consent of the owners of it. It is false. It is wholesale falsehood. So say that we wish to force ourselves upon white people. The bill passed both houses, but the governor was almost afraid to sign it, and the newspaper tried to frighten black people. And this is what I think is what they say. Will any black person or gang of black people attempt to exercise the privilege it confers? Belligerently asked the commercial bulletin. Quote, if they do, it will be at their apparel. He may be able to obtain a ticket of admission, but no New Orleans audience will ever permit him to take his seat, except in the place allotted for people of color, end quote. It continued. Here's a more continuation. What a bunch of racist pricks. Apparently, this state of calm does not suit the radical leaders. Their continual control over this state must depend on the jealousy of black people towards the white people. They feel that men of color race have more confidence in the old citizens of Louisiana than in any newcomer. Hence the effort to revive a strife which would rapidly quiet itself without such stimulus. Warmoth, in his inaugural address, ventured to urge immediate measures of the repression of lawlessness and disorder, now rife to many parts of the state. Hold on, I got a warning. From many parishes, we have almost daily accounts of violence and outrage. In many cases, most brutal and revolting murders, without any effort on the part of the people to prevent or punish them. In a special address to people of color, Warmoth said, "My friends, this is a great day for men of color in Louisiana. It is full of good for you if my hopes and expectations in your favor are well founded. If you are honest, industrious, and peaceful and peaceable, you will have millions of friends who will stand by you and see that you are protected in all the political rights which they would themselves enjoy. You do not wish to intrude yourselves socially upon those who do not want your society any more than you want our people to obtrude themselves upon you without your consent. The contest from which we are emerging has not been for special equality, but for civil and political equality. This last you now have, and it will be my duty to see that you are protected in them. And if I am not mistaken in my opinion of your race, it will be cheerfully accorded to you very soon by everybody. Remember that the road that leads to prosperity for every man, whether white or black, are those of virtues of education and of honesty and sobriety, of industry and obedience to the law." Unfortunately, the state government, inaugurated in July, was almost immediately confronted by the presidential election in November 1868. Skillfully with calculations, the economic problems of Reconstruction were being changed by planters and capitalists to look like problems of politics and social recognition. Beneath this deliberate camouflage, the industrial plans of the Tribune were being slowly submerged until finally murder and mob law seized the state. The whole South was in a blaze of excitement in 1868's election. Tremendous and frequent meetings were held in every city and parish in Louisiana. Every Confederate sympathizer was encouraged and had hopes of what would happen to the South as a result of the election. The Republican Party in Louisiana was paralyzed. Secret semi-military organizations were set up. Riots broke up Republican meetings. Club rooms were raided and destroyed. It was believed that if Seymour and Blair were elected, Reconstruction could be overthrown. The Civil War of secret assassinations and open intimidation and murder began and did not end until 1876, and not entirely then. Strong was the hatred of the reactionaries was towards black people. It was strong towards carpetbaggers, and Democratic state central committees sent out the letter. And we would earnestly declare to our fellow citizens our opinion that even the most implacable and ill-disposed of the black population, those who show the worst spirit towards the white people, are not half as much deserving or our aversion and non-intercourse with them as a debased whites who encourage and aid them, and who become through their votes the official holdings oppressors of the people. Whatever resentments you have should be felt towards the latter, and not against men of color. But in no case should you permit this resentment to go further than to withdraw from them all countenance, association, and patronage, and thwart every effort they may make to maintain a business and social foothold among you. Secret democratic organizations were formed, and all well armed. The Knights of the White, Camellia of the Triple K, and an Italian organized called the Innocents. They all paraded nightly. In the election, Seymour and Blair received 88,225,000 votes. 88, yeah. While Grant and Colfax received 43,859. Out of 21,000 Republican voters in New Orleans, only 276 Republicans vote were cast. There were, in 1870, 726,915 persons in the state. The map of the state showing their violence and intimidation occurred leaves less than a third of the state in peace. Because of the experience of the presidential election in 1868, the legislature was asked to change the election and registration laws and approve the law of March 16, 1870, conferring great power upon the governor. The governor was authorized to appoint a chief election officer who should make a registration of voters in each parish and a board before which the governor would lay all the election returns. This returning board was composed of 3 state officers, a 2 state senator, and it could throw out fraudulent votes or returns secure by violence. This device made government by the mob impossible, but it substituted a possible dictatorship in the hands of the unscrupulous government. Governor Warmoth's attitude towards the finance of the state was characteristics of the original. There was need of money, and he raised it. His statement was of the needs of unexceptional. I found the state and the city of New Orleans bankrupt. Interests of the state and city bonds had been in default for years. The assessed property taxable in the state had fallen in value from 470,464,936 million dollars in 1860 to 250,063,359.63 in 1870. Taxes for the year 1860, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67 were in arrears. The city and state were flooded with state and city shine plaster, which had been issued to meet current expenses. Among the first act of the new legislature was one to postpone the collection of all back taxes, and later they were postponed indefinitely. The public roads were mud trails. There was not a hard surface road in the whole state. There was the one canal and very limited telegraphic facilities. The mails were usually carried on horseback. New Orleans had but 4 paved roads. The amount of the state and city debt was unknown, and the state securities were selling from 21 cents to 25 cents on the dollar. There was no money in either state or city treasury. The New Orleans was a dirty, impoverished, and hopeless city with a mix arrogant, ignorant, corrupt, and bloodthirsty gain and control. Ew. It was flooded with lotteries, gambling dens, and licensed brothels. Many of the city officials, as well as the police force, were thugs and murderers. Violence was rampant, and hardly a day passed that someone had not shot out under the oaks in defense of his honor. There was a demand for businessmen, for more railroads, The legislature granted charters and voted aid for construction. In the past, every railroad in the state had been built in this way. 10 years later, the Democratic legislature in 1878 granted $2 million in bonds to aid in the building of the road of Shreveport, and the bill was signed by Governor Nichols. The great deal of the state indebtedness was represented by this attempt to promote railroad building. And in this attempt, both parties were responsible for making the appropriations. The bill aided the New Orleans, Mobile, and Texas Road. Passed anonymously in the Senate, composed of 21 Republicans and 9 Democrats. In the House, there were 50 Republicans and 9 Democrats who voted for it, and only 3 members voted against it. The bill was incorporating the New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Vicksburg line, where the state assumed a liability of $6 million. The introducer was Democrat, and it passed unanimously in both houses. The same thing was approximately true in 5 other cases, where the state assumed large financial responsibility. The money which Warmoth raised did not go wholly or even perhaps mostly for public objects. He allowed all elements to feed at the public trough. Public debt and taxes mounted. Warmoth, his friends, and many of his enemies began to get rich in the midst of the surrounding poverty. When he was approached about this, the bitter complaint made at the mounting cost of government, he had a suave and effective series of answers. First, he said that the great many of the members of the legislature were arrogant, ignorant black people and easily influenced by lobbyists, and that the men of the community ought to assist him in restraining them. Then he turned around and reminded property holders and capitalists that many of the bills which the legislature was charged with passing corruptly were for the aggrandizement of individuals and corporations, resenting their, quote, very best people, end quote. Their bank president and the best people of New Orleans were, where he said, quote, crowding the lobbies of the legislature, continually whispering into these men's ears bribes. How was the state to be defended, he asked, against the interposition of these people who were potent in their influence in the community? It is apparent that Governor Warmoth understood the terms, quote, best people to be synonymous with the term, quote, richest people. He instanced the case of 5 million bonds bill to take up the city notes, which he had vetoed, which had been passed in the House over his veto. The bill went to the Senate. I walked into the Senate chamber and saw nearly every prominent broker of the city engaged in lobbying that bill through the Senate. It was only by exposing the fact that one of their emissaries had come into this very chamber and laid upon the desk of my secretary an order for $50,000 that I was able to defeat it. Mr. Conway, the mayor of our city, came here and offered me any consideration to induce me to sign this bill. He was said that another senator of New Orleans had offered him a bribe of $50,000 and a share of the profits for his signature to the Nicholson pavement bill. It was not only the fact that unsuccessful jobbers had tried to bribe him, but that successful jobbers and prominent Southern men, without reasonable doubt, had bribed him and knew it, and their mouths were closely shut when it came to details and special instances of stealing. Without a doubt, many of leaders of color shared in this graft, but from the very nature of the case, it was not a large share. Many members of the legislature, black and white, were regularly paid small sums, but on the other hand, leaders like Dunn and Roundenzia were incorruptible, were incorruptible, and lashed the thieves on all sides. Thomas G. Davidson in Livingston Parish, who had been a Democrat in the state since 1826, said that there was corruption in the legislature. No one doubts, but it is not confined to the Republicans alone. It was the man of color, W.F. Brown, who, as Senate Superintendent of Education, called attention to his report in 1873 to the way in which school funds were being stolen. New Orleans, as a legacy from Banks and the Freedmen's Bureau, was one of the few southern states that had a system of public schools. In 1865, there were 141 schools for the free men and 19,000 pupils. The school law had been passed in 1869, providing a system of public education without distinctions of race or color. The system was not carried out. W.F. Brown report. Stolen in Carroll's Parish in 1871, $30,000. In East Baton Rouge, $5,032. In St. Landry, $5,700. In St. Martin, $3,786.80. And Plaquemines, $5,855. Besides large amounts of St. Tammy Cordelia or Morehouse and other parishes. The entire permanent school funds of many parishes disappeared during this period. Joe, do you know you're unmuted? Oh, there you go.
I'm trying to get your attention.
How are you trying to get my attention?
I've been talking for like a minute trying to get through on this stupid thing that won't let me through. I apologize for the S word. I'm sorry. I'm very aggravated at my phone.
Okay.
I was trying to tell you it says Plaquemines.
Many people of color voters tried to swing their votes as to stop corruption, save the schools, and improve their economic conditions. But if this was difficult in South Carolina and Mississippi, it was almost impossible in Louisiana because there was so little choice between the parties aspiring to power. Under these circumstances, it was exceedingly difficult for people of color voters to know what to do. There is no question but that if the black people had been offered a chance to make their leadership effective in alliances with some party of social uplift, they would have followed it in large and increasing numbers. They would have become an honest and teachable electorate and rapidly expelled most of their venal, careless, and dishonest fellows. But what could one choose between men like Warmoth, McHenry, and Carter, a carpetbagger, and a planter, and a scallywag, a buccaneer, a slave driver, and a plain thief? The expenses of the Warmoth government increased to a total of $26,394,578 in 4 years and 5 months. The state debt was $10,099,074 in 1860 and $26,920,499 in 1965, going up. Subtracting the Confederate debt, where there was a total debt of $17,347,051 in 1868. This in 1872 had increased to $29,619,437. Besides this, bonds voted but not yet issued would increase the real and contingent debt of $41,194,473. The tax rate in 1864 was 3.75 million mils. In 1869, it was 5.2 mils. In 1871, 14.5 mils. And in 1872, 21.5 mils. This expense was based on property valuation of, oh my gosh, $435,478,265 in 1860, which with emancipated slaves sank to $200 million in 1865 and rose to $251,696,017 in 1870. George W. Carter, the typical Louisiana scallywag, was a discovery of War Month, of maneuvering him into the legislature. He came to New Orleans soon after War Month was inaugurated. He was in Virginia but had lived in Texas. He, quote, was an apostatized preacher, an ex-Confederate colonel who later turned loyal patriot and anti-War Month leader. Carter was a man of education and Polish, a good speaker, but a absolutely unscrupulous grifter. He was made Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1871 and became head of the ring proposing to control the legislation that offered the chance for blackmail. The history of Louisiana from 1870 to 1876 reads like a Chinese puzzle to those who forget the great forces below, beneath the witch cauldron of political chicanery. It is difficult to remember the great unintelligent mass of white people and black labor, the overwhelming majority of the citizens of Louisiana groping for light and seldom finding expression. Historians quite unanimously forget and ignore them and chronically only the amazing game of politicians. Under the election laws of 1869, Wormhouse secured control of Louisiana election. The governor, through the returning board, which he appointed, could at his discretion throw out any votes anywhere in the state on any pretext. It was to no purpose, so far as results were concerned, that voters were intimidated, mobbed, and killed. Consequently, the election of 1870 was unusually quiet. Then trouble began to brew. The men of color who formed the bulk of Warmoth's following were not willing to supply his unintelligent followers, led by Lieutenant Governor Dunn. They began to revolt in the Republican Convention of August 1870. The convention elected Dunn chairman, passed over Warmoth, and especially opposed the constitutional amendment, which would make the governor eligible for re-election. Warmoth took the stump, adorningly flattered the white planters, and eventually carried his amendment. I promise I wasn't ignoring you. I just didn't know you were trying to talk. I promise. When the new legislature met in January 1871, he faced a new dilemma. Several hundred men of color joined in a large meeting at Louisiana Hotel to protest against this despotism. All the best elements of the state were arrayed against him. One wing of his own party and at least part of the black population. In addition, economic conditions were crying for reform. Men of color nominated Pinchback for the term in the United States Senate, after the term of Harris expired March 4th, 1871. At the same time, the brother-in-law of President Grant, controller of customs at New Orleans, was also wanted to be that the Republican Convention split in August 1871, with Dunn at the head of one faction and Warmoth at the head of another. While Warmoth was temporarily out of the state, Lieutenant Governor Dunn discharged the duties of governor. Although Warmoth resented it, some of the Democratic papers said that they preferred a N-word governor to a carpetbagger. The state convention was called, and Dunn wrote to the leading people of color Republicans, "I write to you to ask of your support and influence in behalf of people of color. I have a great work before us, And in order to be successful, we need the aid and cooperation of every man of color in the state. An effort is being made to sell us out to the Democrats by the governor, and we must nip it in the bud. I ask you to use your influence to elect good, honest men that will look out for the interests of the men of color and not be duped by the money or promises of Governor Warmoth. And above all, do not elect as a delegate any of his office holders who, being under obligation to him for position, will be compelled to support his policies. Warmoth retaliated by joining with Democrats and depriving Lieutenant Governor Dunn of his rights to appoint committee in the Senate. Dunn wrote Horace Greeley in 1871 after Greeley visit South in his structures on carpetbaggers structures. Yeah. There are 90,000 voters in this state, 84,000 of whom are people of color. In my judgment, a fair and untrembled vote being cast 19/20ths of the Republican Party in the state, including a majority of the elective state officers and all of the federal officers, with a few exceptions, are opposed to the administration of the present state executive. We want for ourselves and for the people of all parties better laws on the situated books, and better men to administer the same. And we are persuaded that none of these wants will ever be met so long as the present executive exercises any material control over the politics of Louisiana. We are engaged in no strife of factions, but the people gravely and earnestly are fighting for their personal and political rights against the encroachment of the impudent and unfaithful public servants. Would you be greatly surprised, Mr. Greeley, to be informed that in the judgment of a good people of the state, irrespective of party, the young man who now occupies the executive chair of Louisiana, whose crimes against his party and his people are charitably ignored, and whose championship you so boldly assume is preeminently in the prototype and prince of the tribe of carpetbaggers, who seem to be our pet aversion. Just at this point, November 21st, 1871, Oscar Dunn died, and the Louisiana black people lost an unselfish, incorruptible leader. This was Warmoth's chance, and he secured pinchback support, and at the same time avoided the contingency of having Carter, the scallywag, become governor by securing Pinchback's election as lieutenant governor. This aroused another factional fight in the Republican Party for office, and the patronage with the planters are ready to take advantage of every opportunity, and black people deprived of their leaders. Warmoth rode this storm until his following failed. When he what? Adroitly?
Yeah, adroitly.
Yeah,
You hear me? Adroitly.
leads to the liberal Republican revolt of the North, headed by Horace Greeley. When Chamberlain of the South Carolina joined the Northern Reform wave, he backed his move by excellent reform efforts, despite his dangerous and ultimately fatal alliance with disloyal planters. Warmoth had no program of reform. On the other hand, scallywags like Carter joined the anti-Warmoth Republican faction and urged them to armed revolt. In came the United States troops. Got it. And down came the Congressional Investigating committee and scored Warmoth. The result was that in the campaign of 1872, Warmoth took 125 delegates, 1/5 of whom were people of color, to Cincinnati Convention. This was the largest delegation that any state sent. This again was a shrewd move because the liberal Republicans were attacking graft and theft, both north and south, when this arch grafter ranged himself on their side. Pinchback, under the advice of Sumner, was disposed to follow Warmoth into the liberal Republican Party. But he was alienated when he saw that Warmoth stood instead of leading a real third party movement, was about to surrender to the planters. A curious campaign ensued. The reactionary Democrats nominated John McHenry from one of the worst anti-black parishes of the state, where black people and white Republicans had been murdered by the dozen. No self-respect man of color or liberal of any stamp could vote for him. On the other hand, there was the Reform Party led by Beauregard, which displayed its convention a placard, quote, "Justice to all races, creed and political opinions," end quote. J. Celia Martin, a person of color labor leader from the North, addressed this convention, and also Warmoth, who was working to have this movement and the Democrats unite with the liberal Republicans. The liberal Republicans nominated Penn for governor and a man of color, Nomas, for Secretary of State, while the regular Republicans nominated Kellogg, a man of color, Antonio, and a man of color, Antony. Ugh, stupid burps. Whew. Warmoth tried to get the reactionary Democrats and the liberal Republicans to unite with McHenry and Penn as nominees, and men of color of Armstead as Secretary of State, and Pinchback as congressman at large. Such a ticket Warmoth was sure would, with his power over the returning board, win, and he said by 30,000 majority. But the reactionary planters refused the coalition, and Warmoth capped the climax by surrounding to them completely and backing Emory. There was nothing for Pinchback to do but join the Grant Republicans, he said. It is well known as far as I am concerned that I have no partiality for the governor of the state. I have not stood at his back as once of the supporters or admirers, and that distinguished gentleman. I am not a lover or worshiper of his. If I thought he could secure a Republican government in Louisiana by supporting Mr. Greeley, I would support him. But after a careful observation, I tell you, fellow citizens, if you wish a Republican government and the success of the Republican Party, you can only secure that under the Grant and Wilson ticket. Everybody knows how bitter I am against the Custom House and its party. But I will tell you, my friends, if it is necessary to secure the success of the Republican Party, I will swallow it. All parties took great pains to assure people of color that they would sustain and protect them in all their civil and political rights. The Reform Party, headed by General P.G.T. Beauregard and other distinguished white men, with written approval of several thousands of best white citizens, declared, number one, the henceforth and dedicate ourselves to the unification of our people. Number two, what by, quote, our people, we mean all men of every race, color, or religion, of our citizens of Louisiana, who are willing to work for her prosperity. Number three, we shall advocate by speech, pen, and deed the equal and impartial exercise by every citizen of Louisiana and every civil and political right guaranteed by the Constitution and the law of the United States, and by the law of honor, brotherhood, and fair dealing. Number 4, we shall maintain and advocate the right of every citizen of Louisiana and of every citizen of the United States to frequently, at will, all places of public resort, and to travel at will on all vehicles or public conveyance upon terms of perfect equality with any and every other citizens. And we pledge ourselves, so far as our influence, counsel, and example may go, to make this right a live and practical right, and that there may be no misunderstandings of our views on this point. We shall further recommend that hereafter no distinction shall exist among citizens of Louisiana in any of our public schools or state institutions of education, and in any other public institutions supported by the state, city, or parish. We shall also recommend that the proprietors of all foundries, factories, and other industrial establishments in employing mechanics or workmen make no distinction between two races. When the return came in, Warmoth sought to count in McHenry. And immediately the imposition set up a rival return board and counted in Kellogg. They also got a United States judge to back them. Again, there were practically civil war with 2 returning boards and 2 governments until President Grant sent down United States soldiers and backed the Kellogg government. The Louisiana election of 1868, 72, 74, 76 were one of cloth, intimidation, fraud, open violence, and murder, so that there was no real expression of public opinion. 3 remedies were evident. First, a dictator working through a returning board. Secondly, supervision of elections and repression of mob violence by the federal government. Thirdly, arming a black militia. Carpetbaggers were too corrupt and planters too selfish to be successful dictators. The notion recoiled at federal supervision, not only in the drastic form proposed by Sheridan, but even in the milder form of supervised elections. Finally, arms in the hands of black people aroused fear both north and south. Not that black people could not and would not fight for these setbacks. Same black people, largely under their own officers, had beaten back Louisiana whites at Port Hudson and Milliken's Bend. But it was the silent verdict of all America that black people must not be allowed to fight for themselves. They were, therefore, dissuaded from every attempt at self-protection or aggression by their friends as well as their enemies. Congress, we're doing pretty good. How's everybody doing?
What'd you say?
Okay, I'm just wondering how everybody's doing.
Their kitchen. All their appliances went out. They're broken. They've tried flipping the switches and everything. They lost their fridge and their dishwasher, their microwave, and their rice cooker. So, land?
Oh, that sucks.
Yeah. So we're discussing that privately. So that's what I'm talking about. I'm a little busy.
Yeah, no worries. I was just asking how everybody's doing. Congress hesitated to refuse to take action, despite the pleas of President Grant. Under the law, we had no alternative but to use federal troops to enforce the Reconstruction laws. The result was open war. 3 times the soldiers resorted to power Republican candidates who had been ousted from office by forced or fraudulent elections. In retaliation, the planters murdered black people and Republicans in cold blood at Colfax, Calshata, and other places, and fought pitched battles in the streets of New Orleans. It was a humiliating and disgraceful situation. Kellogg attempted reforms and succeeded to reduce the tax rate from 21 to 14 mills. But many parishes refused to pay taxes, and while the New Orleans Board of Trade and leading businessmen approved Kellogg's policy, his reforms could not go far. In fact, just as in South Carolina, there was nothing that Louisiana wanted less at that time than reform through black voters and Republican office holders. Evidently, the black voters and even the office holders could not be held to blame for the anarchy and turmoil, which are the history of Reconstruction in Louisiana. Practically, so-called Reconstructions in Louisiana was a continuation of the Civil War. That's interesting. With black people as pawns between the two forces of Northern and Southern capitalists, just like before. The Northerners were determined to use the state for their own interests, but willing to omit universal suffrage under property control, while planters united in secret organizations with poor whites were determined to reduce the labor vote by disenfranchising black people. Between these two forces, black people was victim and peon. His intelligence and sacrificing leadership was beaten back, deceived and harmed and hamstrung, and finally discredited by charging it with plans to Africanize Louisiana. The shrewd and venal and dishonest black elements were characterized as typical and used as an excuse for cheating the lawlessness by elements of the white population, just as dishonest and much more influential. Back of this smoke screen laid the real charge, which was the attempt to subject this state to rich in raw materials. So rich in raw materials, sorry. And so strategic to trade to the dictatorship of labor rather than an oligarchy of capitalists. But the panic of 1873 and the Democratic House elected to Congress in 1874 settled the matter. The Louisiana Democratic State Convention frankly called itself, quote, "We, the white people of Louisiana," end quote. And the Committee of Congress sent down to investigate revealed the new temper of the nation. One part of the committee was completely in favor of the planters, while the other part declared the White League at scrupulous engine and fraud and murder. The crucial election of 1876 came, and with it came anarchy, as John Sherman and his fellow reported. Organized clubs of masked armed men, formed as recommended by the Central Democratic Committee, rode through the country at night, marking their course by the whippings, shootings, and wounding, maiming, mutilation, and murder of women and children, and defenseless men, whose houses were forcibly entered while they slept, and as their inmates fled, the pistols, the rifles, the knives, and the rope were employed to do their horrid work. Crimes like these testify to by the scores of witnesses were the means employed in Louisiana to elect a president of the United States. Jesus. Louisiana sucks. They're worse than Mississippi.
Yeah, it's very, very racist here.
No, just the history so far, too.
Right, but that hasn't changed. These are the same people that all around.
I didn't say it changed, but I'm just saying it's like the history's bad, too. The revolt was two sets of returns for presidential electors and for the state officers to governors and two legislators. The whole nation waited on the outcome of Louisiana, which would settle the presidential contest. There followed an extraordinary period of negotiations, probably unparalleled in modern governments. The white folk of Louisiana, with threat of civil war, enter into the negotiations with the president and the president-elect and arranged a filibuster of 116 congressmen to prevent counting the electoral votes. The Hayes Party promised to work for the material prosperity of the South and allied sectional feelings. Nichols and the legislature gave every assurance. They solemnly agreed not to deprive black people of any political or civil rights enjoyed by any other class, and to educate white and black children with equal advantages. Finally, the filibuster was dropped and the electoral count was finished March 2nd. Hayes became president. An extra legal commission went to Louisiana in April by means of money furnished by the Louisiana Lottery Company and large businesses establishments. And the Kellogg government was bribed to disband, and the Nickel legislature obtained the nominal quorum. On April 24th, the federal troops withdrew to their barracks, and Louisiana was free from a new period of unhampered exploitation of the working class. In South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, the portions of black people was so large, their leaders so sufficient power. Their leaders of sufficient. And the federal control was effective. That for the years 1868 through 1874, and while the will of black labor was powerful, and so far as it was intelligently led and had definite goals, it took perceptible steps towards public education, confiscation of large incomes, betterment of labor conditions, universal suffrage, and in some cases, distribution of land to the peasants. Ignorant and vicious leaders, white and black, hindered and even stopped this progress, and gradually tended towards a duel between northern and southern capitalists to effect control of labor. This succeeded after in Louisiana, when in Mississippi, and finally in South Carolina. In each case, labor control passed into the hands of white Southerners, who combined with white labor to oust northern capitalists. And here's a poem, everybody. You ready? O twin of monarchy, that lives to rob and kill. What? Oh my gosh. Delvatry. Here, that prostitutes at will, that keeps a robber gang in kindly rights enthroned, then turns their robberies to legal acts condoned, is not the blood as pure of him who lives by toil. He was waxed fat of idleness and spoil. That was L.S. Oliver. And that's the end of that. And we're going to be on chapter 7, because the two eyes mean chapter 7. The white proletariat in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. We're going to stop. This is a good stopping spot. I know it's 10 but it's a good stopping point, because we just went over what happened to black people and everything. And Louisiana, we went over Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi. And oh my God, what page? Hold on a second. 536. 536. All right, everybody. What would you like to say?
Yeah, it sounds very familiar to what is currently going on with when it mentioned the inclusion of black people into, I think it was saying the work of black people into the jobs of being officers, if I remember right.
Yeah, leadership positions. What they did is they put them in non-powerful positions. You know what I mean? And they made it so that if they voted on anything, that it wouldn't give them any power. So they limited them. You know,
I was going to say the rhetoric that it mentioned sounds very similar to the rhetoric that is used for DEIA.
Yeah.
And it's saying oh, it's focusing on including this group and not the merit that they have. That has not changed much, if at all.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Hello,
Yes,
hello.
now we can.
Hello.
Now we
There
can.
I am.
Now we
Okay. I know it takes forever, and then I got to push the mute button 8,000 times. Communists, that's not what they did. Put black people in positions of great leadership. Lieutenant governor is a very important position. The problem was then the people came in and bribed them because they were politicians. Same that they bribed the white people more, and they got the people to turn on their own people. And it really put Louisiana back for a very long time. Huey P. Long, who was governor of the state, was assassinated in our state house back in like 1920s, 1930s area, was actually the guy that got us all the roads, because up till then, Louisiana was 90% dirt roads. We never got roads. Our schools were, the money was stolen from the schools, so our schools were like one-room houses that were for a whole parish. It was really bad how much money got and still gets put in people's pockets. Like, it's a joke in Louisiana that it's the good old boy government, because every construction job goes to Bow Brothers in the state, which is like blatantly obvious that we're just putting money in Bow Brothers' pockets, and it's like nothing. It hasn't changed. It's still run the same way. Where, like, if you know somebody, you'll be paid from the government, and it doesn't matter how bad of a job you do or how long it takes.
You starting to see the beginnings? Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think you might have been starting to say it too, but I think that this might be the start of a comprador class.
Well, no, I was going to say, have you guys starting to see like how like this history is pertinent to understand what's going on and why it's rooted in this stuff and where it comes from? Like, I noticed that when reading this book, even though I don't have the particular details of everything, you could see the making of what we're realizing now in the present. So it's very important to seek the correct historical context critically, and to be able to understand today's and why it's this way. So I'm starting to see a lot more too, because he is focused on more on like the Reconstruction part of people be put in office and all these like amendments and stuff like that, and making it either a labor government, but they're trying not to make it a labor government. They're trying to make it an oligarchy government and stuff like that. So like I see the beginnings of these things, and I think it helps to understand, why do we act like this? Why do our governments do this? I mean, I know, but like, it's good to see the history,
Yes. Okay, there I am. Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, I know it's early. Do you have anything to say before I close it out? We'll start with the next chapter. We'll learn about, what are we going to learn about the next chapter? The next chapter, we'll learn about the white proletariat in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. So we'll find out what's going on with that. Because, I do like how he talks about the poor whites and stuff like that, and what their function and what their position was too, and all this stuff too. You know what I mean? So I do enjoy that a little bit, because it shows you that white people just turn on anybody for power, for status quo and stuff like that. Even if they're in the same class standing as a person of color or anything like that. Goes to proof that we turn against non-people of color, non-white people. So, anybody else? Anything? All right.
I just want to say much love. Take care.
Yeah.
See y'all later.
Yeah, we'll close it out early. I didn't want to go into the next chapter. I don't think it would be a good idea. I think the next chapter should start from tomorrow. So, all right.